Good night. Agent Mahara here. I want to talk a little bit about, again, on the subject of borderlines and why many of them, and especially untreated, don't stop running back to the cluster B wounding parent. Usually mother, often mother, sometimes father, sometimes a combination of both or both. So why do borderlines and their original trauma bonds? Well, this is another reason why people with BPD, many, not all, but unless they get into significant treatment, hit the desk, unless they get into significant treatment, won't be able to, like I said in the last video about this, on this topic area, they don't really separate, and they don't individuate, and they remain enmeshed. But more to the point, is so much very deeper than that for most people with BPD, and especially untreated. It's the original trauma bond. So for the 87% of people diagnosed with the trauma response known as borderline personality, gets pathologized as if it's a medical thing, as if it's a broken brain thing. No, it's a lot of trauma, and it's something that people with BPD can heal and recover from if they will engage in therapy, and if they will get out of the narrative of the pseudoscience of the American Psychiatric Association. And may I just say, I will have much more coming on that with the hegemony of Big Pharma. And that I'm not just pulling this out of the ether. It's not just my opinion. It's really becoming much more established around the world what the APA's agenda is, how bad their pseudoscience is, as opposed to what's going on in other areas of psychiatry and other areas of the world. But so people who go on to be diagnosed with whatever borderline personality is supposed to mean, besides it's a trauma response, and now serious mental illness, that's the APA, because around the world they're starting to look at BPD and NPD for the trauma responses they are, not only to inform treatment, but really to change the lexicon of the language, which is way overdue. So when an infant is born to a cluster B mother, untreated, as so many of them are, whether it be a woman, mother with BPD or NPD or comorbidly both, or any other differential diagnoses with BPD, but just BPD alone is enough to do it. To do what? To create the first trauma bonding experience of a young infant to toddler who goes on to believe that love, it's Stockholm Syndrome on steroids from the beginning for these people. They go on to believe they don't learn any differently, and they have the arrested self, the arrested emotional development. So they go on to believe that love is trauma, that love is pain, that love is sacrifice of self in the aspect of codependency in BPD. People with BPD in this original trauma bond with the mother that doesn't mirror appropriately with what Alan M. Shore calls affect synchrony, with the misattunement, with sometimes stress, sometimes really treating an infant harshly, and sometimes just not the neglect factor, just not meeting the infant's needs. And when infants' needs aren't met like that, or if they're intermittently met, sets up the first original trauma bond. Because when an infant is experiencing this affect synchrony, misattunement, maybe the emotional neglect for long periods of time, way longer than an infant can tolerate, not having their cry bring, the original face, the first love object, mother, to help them with what they need. So on a biological level, that will leave memory, imprints on the brain. But the infant's response that creates so much of what the trauma of BPD is about. The infant's response is one of a biological threat to survival with apex synchrony, misattunement, emotional neglect, just not having those crucial needs met in childhood, not having emotional safety, angry mother 1 minute, maybe not so angry the next, stressed out, not really emotionally available, not attuned, not smiling at the infant, not doing all these things that are so crucial in that first, infancy to toddlerhood to 2 years of age. And so this is for people with BPD. With 87% of them diagnosed with it, it is the first trauma bond. And then what do they go on to know about or learn about anything different than that? They don't. And the arrested emotional development. So that really forms the fact that they have disorganized attachment. And the fact that they really don't attach because they didn't attach to the first love object. They didn't attach to what Bradshaw says, mother space is the world. And when there's no attachment there's a trauma bond. And then they're informed about, quote, what love is or what care is, or that, like, there's a lack of nurture. And why is it that so many people with BPD, absolutely everybody with the diagnosis of BPD, until less significant treatment, can't soothe themselves? It's very, very at the core. And it really goes back to this trauma bonding experience with a cluster B wounding mother. They're very abusive in one way or another, or more than one way or another. So this is the original trauma bond, and this is the core central piece of what forms the repetition compulsion cycles in relating. Because all they know how to do is relate in the way that they survived in, from infancy to early toddlerhood with a wounding cluster B mother. Can also be a wounding father, or like I had two parents. One father was dark Chad, mother NPD, comorbid BPD, or vice versa. And so in that case, it's like, yes, many young children will also be hurt, abused, traumatized by the father in some, families of origin. And so I'm not saying mothers are more important than fathers, except for that initial, when the infant is born, and the mother's the first love object, and that base, and the attunement to what the infant is hardwired to look for, because what people need to be able to be healthy, adults, when they're older is critical phase. So it is, like I said, the original trauma bond, and then it forms along with attachment trauma and abandonment trauma, and the loss of self. It forms all that these people have to go on when they're untreated about how to relate, which is next to nothing, because they've been abused. They've had, emotional neglect, maybe worse, and abuse, lack of attunement. It's a trauma bond. And then, no kid wants to feel unloved. Kids try to get love, even from the most wounding cluster B parents, wounding cluster B mother. And so the borderline's first trauma bond with the attachment and abandonment trauma and what's at the core is all they know how to go forward with. And then what happens when you meet them and you don't know what their issues are, or what the problem or the challenges are? Oh boy, I think I'm going to sneeze. Just give me a second and excuse me. So yeah, where was I? The sneeze blew my mind. No. Yeah, so then when they're trying to get in relationship with you and to bond with you, in idealization and mirroring and the codependent people-pleasing of people with BPD, or maybe who haven't and aren't diagnosed yet, or have that trauma, more to the point, what they're trying to do there is please you and mirror you, like they've been trying to do usually for all through their childhood, to try to connect to the cluster B wounding parent or parents, but especially the cluster B wounding mother, where the trauma bond, their first trauma bond, forms. So then as you get into this relationship, and most people who get into these relationships with people with BPD unknowingly have codependency. That could be made worse in the relationship, but there's likely some underpinning to start with and from your family of origin experience. And you don't know, you might not know what BPD is. You have no way to back up or not do this, right? But what you can't know is when you think that they're attaching to you, this is where the replication of repetition compulsion cycles come in, the reenactment of trauma. They're still going to experience you as the abandoning, misattuned, not understanding them, not validating them, not enough nurture, not enough soothing, no matter what you do, parent. So then this is the trauma bond foundation of how it is that people with BPD don't attach, can't love. And yet you think that they're so attaching to you and you're attaching to them. And then you think they so love you or they can receive your love, which I've talked a lot about isn't true. So then what happens is people with codependency have their own, not necessarily does the trauma bond form in childhood, but for some people with codependency at a later age, it can be like a trauma bonded relationship or very much like that. But for people with BPD from really the beginning of life on, it's this Stockholm syndrome. Because they're being either, neglected, emotionally abused, sometimes physically, even at younger ages, sexually. Needs aren't met, apex synchrony, misattunement, and there's more to it than that. But the attachment and abandonment trauma, all of that is just insurmountable. And it also is the reason why people with BPD have so much emotionality and no ability to control any of it, because they were never shown how. It was never modeled to them. They were not soothed as infants. And so all of that matters. And then you get into this relationship and the trauma bond fit, right? People with codependency have had some woundedness in childhood. For some people, it's kind of like there's really not a distinction, but adverse childhood experience versus the same level, so not same degree or level of trauma as a person with BPD. Or the difference might be that the trauma isn't very different degrees of, but that people with codependency have a more resilient temperament as well. So there's nothing broken about people with BPD. They're not born that way. They're not destined to stay the same way if they'll get treatment. But the borderline's original trauma bond, Stockholm syndrome experience, and then they're pursuing in a codependent way as they start to get older what they need so badly from this wounding cluster B mother in particular. It sets the stage for the impossibility of relating. Now, people with codependency have, to a lesser degree, an impossibility of finding a healthier partner, of relating. People with codependency struggle with intimacy, and of course there's the externalized out pattern. But I won't go on in this video. I'll just say, so when you do meet that borderline, the idealizing mirroring, they're not setting out to trick you. They don't seduce or force you in any way to be with them. They're just often extremely fantastic looking men or women. They're very attractive. They're very dynamic. They're very intense. They're bringing a lot to the table really quickly when you meet them that people with codependency have emotional need for and hunger for. And so the trauma bond connection happens really quickly. And whatever kind of slams together is destined to blow apart. Now, if you haven't seen my video on this yet, you might want to check it out. How the BPD relationship, as soon as it starts, it begins to end. And it is an unconscious setup between the person with BPD and the codependent. Neither one knows what's about to happen. So the trauma bond for the borderline is their original experience with the first love object mother, the first object other. So we need to have, in childhood, or like by going through a lot of therapy later, people need to get either in childhood or in therapy later in a healing and recovery journey from BPD, which is doable. People can absolutely recover from this. But it is a tremendous amount of work, and it does take a rather long time. But the thing is, even with that, it's like, so they have to be able to do all that work to really understand how they are for themselves and for others, relational nightmares, and how it's a relational impossibility. And so they come into relationships, people with BPD, and especially untreated, into relationships with codependency and having had an original trauma bond as their only map forward, if you will, which is, there's not much on that map. And so then they start, and when they don't relate, when it's not a successful bonding and attachment to the first object other, then unless and until they get significant therapy and go have that process, happen in therapy, where the therapist will take the place of significant object other or object other. And then all that relational, all the things that person has to find himself, all the trauma that they have to work through and heal. So people with BPD come to you in the way they do, but with an original deep trauma bond in 87% of cases, people with BPD, and already having, among other things and challenges, experienced Stockholm Syndrome, sometimes right from the first day of life on. So so all I'm saying is, yeah, we hold people with BPD responsible for their behavior in adulthood, but you have to remember that untreated people with BPD, or think about it now after the fact, but take care of yourself first and foremostly. But people with BPD really are not doing half as much from the beginning, to the big devaluation split and the roller coaster ride, and you're walking on the eggshells. I'm not saying they don't do anything consciously, purposefully, but so much isn't consciously, purposefully. So why do so many people with codependence negate, or don't understand this, but negate it in the sense that, because you get so hurt, it has to all be their fault. They're responsible for a lot of things, right? Even though they don't know what they're doing most of the time consciously. But people with codependency tend to negate their responsibility. Things like, feeling like you were seduced, you were fooled. Like as if people with BPD are narcissists. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're not the same. And all people with BPD aren't the same. They don't make you do anything. And maybe it just feels like that later. But they don't make you get into the relationship. They don't seduce you into the relationship. People with codependency have to take responsibility that you entered a relationship that you could not have known what was going to happen in. And the person with BPD is just equally as consciously unaware as people with codependency are. So the borderline's first trauma bond happens with the wounding cluster B parent, which is mother to begin with. It could also involve a father. And that's the other reason why they can't separate. They haven't individuated. They remain enmeshed because they're always in pursuit of that object other never attached to, trauma bond with the cluster B mother, and that's the way they're going to be relating to you too. In search of identity, in search of fusion, enmeshment, the urge to merge. Some people with codependency have the urge to merge too, in a different way for different reasons. So the borderline comes out of childhood into adulthood, untreated or undiagnosed, with Stockholm Syndrome and having already experienced their only, quote, connection to whatever degree was a trauma bond. And that's all they can carry forward. And I'll talk more about the trauma bonded nature of how codependents end up being the other 50% of the borderline's trauma bond. So I hope that was helpful. And I think that there's more, there's so much more I'm going to be talking about this. So much more depth, so much more to explore that people just take for granted. I have so much more depth information to share. And I'm still trying to look at what I'm going to share where. And so there likely will be some video series coming on this as I go even deeper to what all this really means and more about the anatomy of how it happens. And the reality that to just say that people with BPD, this, that, or the other, is to negate not only the attachment and the abandonment trauma and the abuse in 87%, the trauma in their early childhoods and beyond, and the trauma of having an arrested self that they don't know anymore, a lost self. Make no mistake about it, they come out of childhood into adulthood already having experienced that original trauma bond and with Stockholm Syndrome. So it's not like they just trauma bond or make you have Stockholm Syndrome. That's going on for people with codependency. It gets made worse by what's happening with people with BPD, but I'll talk more about that in another video or a video series. It might not be on YouTube, it might be on my website, and that won't be free. But just realize that the way that BPD has been talked about, what you've learned a lot about it, you can choose to turn me off any moment you want. And you can choose to keep going back to the old information. But I'm not the only one. There's much more information out there now than some people on YouTube are going to describe the way that I do. Or that some people talking about BPD can't go this deep. They have no idea what they're talking about. Or if they do, it's very surface. But the bottom line is, this is how formidable the trauma foundations and underpinnings of borderline personality are. So the tragedy is for the people that have BPD or will go on to be diagnosed with it, they don't have this in their conscious awareness. They need a lot of therapy to work it all out, to heal. And people with codependency can't see what's coming either. And therein you have the trauma-bonded tragedy of the impossibility of these relationships, in large part because of what happens and how traumatized people with BPD are. And then when that trauma meets with the trauma or adverse experience of the codependent. So I hope that was helpful. I hope it gave you something to think about. Take care.